Everyone, and welcome to this CRITT lecture. I welcome Erik Angelone. Sorry for the delay. So I give a short introduction to Erik. Erik Angelone has received his PhD in translation studies from University of Heidelberg and his MA in international communication from the University of Maryland in this country. He worked as a lecturer of translation studies at the University of Heidelberg and a professor of translation studies at the Zurich University of Applied Science, and is currently professor of translation studies here at Kent State University. His research interests include language, industry studies, process-oriented translation, training and assessment, and cognitive processes in translation. He is a member also of the TREC thematic network on empirical research in translation and cognition. So his talk today will touch in one of his areas of specialization, which is weaving adaptive expertise into competence frameworks and language industry training. Please, Erik, go ahead. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mikhail, for the introduction. Let me go ahead and get my slides up here.
Yep.
And thanks everyone for attending. Let me see. Can you see the slides?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, yeah, so the title of my talk, as Mikhail said, is Weaving Adaptive Expertise into Competence Frameworks and Language Industry Training. So just a short overview of the directions I'll go with this talk. I'll start by taking very brief stock of the language industry. Suffice to say, we're continuing to see a tremendous sea change in the language industry with things practically changing overnight at breakneck speed. And one of the primary changes that we're seeing in survey data is a growing need for diversification, both within individual language industry strands and also across strands. And I think the time is right for us to not necessarily reconceptualize, but perhaps re-envision what expertise implies in a pedagogical sense in light of this growing need for diversification. And then I'll spend a good chunk of the presentation talking about some implications for competence models and training. So let's start by taking brief stock of the industry. What we're seeing here is data from NIMSY, the language industry market research company in the US, and they're projecting steady growth through 2026, growing to $84.9 billion. So the industry is undeniably growing. We're seeing a proliferation of career paths, both upstream and downstream, from the central pillars of translation and interpreting, largely in response to automation, but not only in response to automation. And career paths that didn't exist 5 or 10 years ago, things like data curation come to mind, or solutions architects come to mind. Esther Bond, who works for Slater, a think tank, a language industry think tank in Switzerland, analyzed LinkedIn profiles of language industry professionals and found, if I remember correctly, upwards of 300 different titles. So just tremendous proliferation in that sense in terms of what's happening in the industry. And then at the same time, we hear about stagnant compensation, and it really depends on which part of the world we're talking about. But if we're looking at freelancers, a lot of the data seem to suggest that rates and compensation are stagnant. Some studies are suggesting a return to normalcy. But even more concerning than that is the talk of Uberization. This was one of the big talking points at the S conference in Oslo this past summer, where you have translation platforms and the work ultimately goes to those who are translating at the lowest rates. And this is, of course, concerning, and there's this palpable sense of angst and uncertainty right now, not just in the industry, but also in training contexts. So it's important also for us to sort of see how language industry professionals are faring in light of what's happening. And I'd like to share some data from the most recent Ellis survey, the European Language Industry Study Survey, in which 745 independent language professionals or freelancers took part. And one of the questions had to do with stress factors for these freelancers. And sure enough, one of the biggest stress factors has to do with pricing, pay and rates, and the economic climate in general. So 77% of the freelancers strongly agree that this is one of the primary stressors in the industry, along with machine translation and things like time management. So we're seeing a situation where freelancers often have to produce more in a shorter period of time for the same compensation. And yeah, I mean, that's having a tremendous impact on things. If we dig a little bit deeper into this data, and this is actually quite eye-opening or sobering, one of the questions was, are you earning enough as a freelancer? And I guess the silver lining here on the left, we see a little bit of an increase from 2021 to 2022. But yeah, I mean, still at the end of the day, and on the right, we see that interpreters are faring a little bit better than translators. But at the end of the day, we're still seeing a situation where about 1/3 of language industry professionals are struggling to earn enough through translation or interpreting alone. So they're taking on other work within the language industry and other strands, or they're working outside of the language industry. I think it's also interesting to see where students stand on this. This is also data from the Ellis 2022 survey. What do they see as the primary challenges? And it isn't the technology. It isn't something like balancing theory and practice. It's uncertainty of a professional future, not really knowing where everything is headed. And motivated by some of these studies, I decided to undertake a couple of surveys as well here at Kent State, where I intended to gauge the experiences of our alumni of our MA program in translation to see how they're faring in the industry. So the first of these surveys was done in 2021. I had a total of 41 participants. This is actually a subset of data from a larger study. 41 graduated within the past 5 years from our MA program. And I found that 43 are working in a different language industry strand now than they were 5 years ago. And sort of echoing what we saw in the Ellis survey, 71% have worked across different language industry strands simultaneously at some point in the 5 years. So this underscores this idea of people not just translating and interpreting, but rather working across strands simultaneously. Ideally, this is of their own volition. I didn't ask if they're doing this out of necessity to make ends meet, or if this is actually a preference. And that's something I'd like to follow up on in a future survey. But fact of the matter here, 71% are simultaneously working across different strands. And in terms of job titles, translators, localizers, transcreators, they're managing projects, they're doing consulting work, they're working in quality assurance, they're solution architects, or again, more times than not, some hybrid combination thereof. So yeah, tremendous. This is what I meant by a growing need for diversification in terms of what's being done, how this work is being done, where, and with whom. Here's a more granular look at what these 41 participants are doing in the language industry. So this is a master's degree in translation, heavily geared in its curriculum towards specialized translation. Only 3 of the 41 participants are making a living exclusively through translation, 7%. And as we see here with the data, 63% or 26 out of 41 are working in what I'm calling a hybrid capacity, where they're translating, but they're also simultaneously over the course of a given work week or a given work month, engaging in some of these other tasks, ranging from subtitling to vendor management to, localization engineering, or in media accessibility, audio description, or they're working in tech onboarding. So a pretty broad spectrum here in terms of what these language industry professionals are doing. Yeah, what are the drivers of this growing need for diversification? There are several, and this is by no means, an exhaustive list. Slater feels that the transition from desktop computing, translation of text and isolation to cloud-based translation or mediation of content in a collaborative fashion is the biggest driver of change when we're talking about diversity. Of course, artificial intelligence comes to mind here, and the fact that you have diversification stemming from varying levels of automation and quality expectations. Mediation of different types of content. Again, some of the content being mediated these days didn't even exist a decade ago. This continuous proliferation of assistive technologies. One of the big talking points last week, or was it 2 weeks ago, at the Translating Europe Forum, was this idea of freelancers, where the technology use is mandated, where they're being asked to use maybe 5 different technologies. And the point to be made there, and I'll return to this, is it's not about teaching 5 different CAT tools, the ins and outs of 5 different CAT tools. It's rather teaching the underlying processes so that students know what to do with tools that aren't even on the market yet when they enter the market. But it's interesting, this idea of technologies being mandated. I think the idea of style guides being mandated or translation memories being mandated has been around for a while, but it really kind of moves beyond that based on what language industry professionals were saying last week. And then this proliferation of career paths is also resulting in diversification. So it seems like at the moment, at least, we have 2 primary scopes of diversification. One of these we see on this slide, the so-called linguist, language industry professional. By no means am I advocating for the label linguist. I think at least in academic circles, when we think of a linguist, we don't necessarily think of people working in the language industry. It has a very different, at least a very different denotative meaning. But this is the label, this idea linguist, this is being used in the industry. This is being used, for example, in job advertisements posted by TransPerfect or Lionbridge or the larger LSPs. And this is something that Sylvia Bernardini and her colleague mentioned at the S conference as well. And these are people who over the course of a given work week or a given work month are translating, perhaps pre-editing and post-editing. They're providing consulting services, they're localizing, they're interpreting, perhaps they're curating data or cleaning corpora. So they're really working across these different strands. So it's a relatively broad scope of diversification. At the same time, or at the other end of the spectrum, we have the so-called deep specialist. I know that Chris Durbin has been advocating for this for quite some time. For example, a deep specialist translator in a premium market. This idea of carving your niche and succeeding in that capacity. And I think even within this niche of highly specialized translation, we still see a need for diversification. Especially if it's true that the use of certain resources are mandated. So in some situations, we might see self-selection of resources. Other times it might be mandated. Different levels of automation and quality expectations, often tied to budget and infrastructure and time. Sometimes these deep specialists are working alone directly with clients. Other times they're embedded in a much more robust or at least large scale project workflow. And the tendency for goalposts to move. At times things go according to plan. And in other situations, we see these moving goalposts that call for adaptation and diversification of how the task is approached. So what does this have to do with expertise? How can we examine or research expertise in response to a growing need for diversification? And we see different epistemologies. Hanna Risku and Daniela Schlager wrote a very helpful chapter in 2021 that provides a map of sorts for the different epistemologies. So you have information processing, focused on things like problem identification and decision making, uncertainty management and memory retrieval. You have this hermeneutic constructivist dimension that's more in the domain of interpretation and self-reflection, involving metacognition and self-monitoring, things like assessing different courses of action. And then more recently, this was born out of cognitive translatology, Munoz Martin's cognitive translatology paradigm, and situated cognition, which looks at expertise as it pertains to interaction and negotiation. Risku has published a number of very insightful pieces on this. So the utilization of artifacts and tools, or expertise as it pertains to interaction with other stakeholders. So I guess the point I'm making here is that all of this is important in the language industry if we're talking about a growing need for diversification. Both the cognitive, the computational model or conceptualization of expertise, as well as this more sociological paradigm or conceptualization, both are equally important. And I'm actually glad to see, and I think most people in the TPR community are glad to see convergence in this sense. I don't think the two should be conflated. I think both have an important place in research. Both experimental and ethnographic, and I think we'll see a lot more of this moving forward. In terms of expertise acquisition, and I hate to reduce things to binaries or two approaches, but it seems like in the literature, at least in the translation studies literature, there's discussion of routinized expertise and adaptive expertise. And routinized expertise, which has its roots in cognitive psychology, involves consistently superior performance in a given domain. The domain is usually fairly narrowly defined, and the tasks are well defined. So Erickson and Charnas looked at chess players, or looked at musicians or athletes, where at least to some extent you have a finite set of strategies to accomplish tasks. Greg Shreve wrote a very nice piece on deliberate practice, which talks about routinized expertise in the context of translation. So yeah, routinized expertise enables solving familiar types of problems quickly and accurately. This is where we often see I guess to some extent still controversial 10-year, 10,000-hour roadmap. I think Greg Shreve highlighted the fact that the idea here is you put in 10 years, you put in 10,000 hours, and you can emerge as an expert, whatever that implies, in our field. But he emphasized the point that this needs to be deliberate practice. So getting immediate feedback, working at an appropriate difficulty level, intrinsic motivation, having opportunities to correct mistakes. That's what makes practice deliberate. And the whole routinized part, basically this involves honing your long-term and short-term memory stores, quickly recognizing prototypical patterns, and the automation of procedures, hence this idea of proceduralization. Now, in the literature, routinized expertise, of course, is very helpful in certain domains, but some scholars have highlighted the fact that there might be some potential issues when tasks tend to vary. So domain limitation and a potential lack of transferability. If we take this back to the language industry, assuming someone is an expert, a quote unquote expert as a specialized translator, to what extent does that expertise transfer over to something as close as post-editing, or something as relatively far removed as audio description or content authoring. And again, if we have these language industry professionals working across these strands, I think it's high time for more empirical research on the transferability of expertise. And again, I think Hanna Risku and her colleagues in Vienna are moving their research in that direction, actually looking at things like team expertise and shared cognition and shared expertise, still largely underexplored in language industry research. Another risk, potential risk at least, of routinized expertise is what Feltovich and colleagues refer to as functional fixedness. In other words, you're so deeply ingrained in these proceduralized approaches and pattern recognition, as soon as patterns are no longer in place, there's this tendency to become fixated and not be able to, well, think outside of the box, so to speak, if the task calls for creativity or novelty in problem solving. So again, I mentioned this growing need for diversification, which is fairly well documented in various surveys. So I guess the question becomes, what is truly routinized these days in the language industry? And I'm not saying that there isn't a place for routinized expertise, but I think it's equally important for us to take a closer look at adaptive expertise, which comes to us from educational psychology and can be defined as optimal performance across different tasks, and when tasks are ill-defined or call for some level of novelty in problem solving. In one of his publications, Greg Shreve identified translation as a classic exemplar of an ill-defined task. And to some extent, that's true. It's kind of messy when you think about it. There's very little in the way of overlap from a routinized expertise perspective. Things aren't particularly well defined. And that's where adaptive expertise comes into play. So it's rooted in more flexible problem-solving heuristics and this transferability of acquired knowledge and skills. So by definition, the focus is on transferability. I'd like to make a call for more extensive research on this transferability if we really are going to see adaptive expertise as something that's crucial in response to diversification in the industry. So adaptation here across different tasks, across different tools, and across interaction with different stakeholders or agents in the context of project workflows. Risku and Schlager nicely regard adaptive expertise as involving coping with difficult conditions and inappropriate roles. So there's that ill-definedness, right? That moving away from something that's truly well-defined, yet still delivering work that fulfills customer expectations, right? That really stuck with me as something that nicely captures the idea of adaptive expertise. So, digging a little bit deeper when we're talking about this ill-definedness and diversification, when we think about tasks in the industry, they tend to be novel, they tend to be dynamic, and they tend to be vague, at least oftentimes. So novelty, what was previously learned no longer applies. And, obviously, if you're using assistive technologies like translation memories, we talk about recycling content and reusing content. But this novelty, I guess at a very basic level, we're not translating the same text twice. I mean, I guess it could happen in the industry, but that's quite rare. With the dynamic nature, tasks are ever changing and fluid. Project specifications are often laid out, but then change on the fly. So that's the fluidity. And then, the vagueness, either underdefined or completely undefined expectations and responsibility. This is the messiness that we see in the language industry and where adaptive expertise comes into play. So, sort of intrigued by adaptive expertise and this idea of diversification, I did a follow-up survey with our alumni earlier this year and wanted to get a better sense of what forms of adaptation they experience in the industry and what they regard as being important. So one of the survey questions was, on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being least important, 5 being most important, how would you rate the importance of adaptation as it pertains to your job for each of the following? So the rows in green all yielded a mean Likert scale rating of 4 or higher, working with different project specifications. I don't think that's anything new. Working with different clients or project managers, same thing there. Working in conjunction with different deadlines. And then we start to see this diversification. So working across different language industry strands. And even the rows that aren't in green still had a mean Likert scale rating of 3 or higher. So working with different constellations of stakeholders across projects, working with different assistive technologies, working in different virtual or physical spaces, and working at different rates or compensation amounts. And I think, going back to the title of this talk, weaving adaptive expertise into training, I think these are all things that we can, to a greater or lesser extent, introduce in training contexts with an eye towards honing adaptive expertise. And there are some interesting simulation projects going on out there that actually focus on these types of things and actually embrace this idea of going with ill-defined tasks and deliberately setting things up in a messy fashion, which simulates what we see in the industry. Another question in this 2022 follow-up survey with our alumni, and again, this was with an eye towards curricular revision and course revision. I asked the participants if they had any suggestions for ill-defined tasks that they've experienced and that call for flexibility and problem solving that we could incorporate in our courses. And the intention here was to hear their voice, this emic voice, instead of basing things on, faculty impressions or faculty likes and dislikes, actually to hear from these alumni who are now working in the industry and using their lived experience as a way of introducing adaptive expertise. So here was one of the responses. Expose them to when things go wrong situations and have them work through those scenarios. Even just having the ability to imagine that X, Y, and Z problems could occur, to project potential hiccup points in ongoing processes and procedures, and then to brainstorm potential solutions would help prepare them. It would give them mental resources to draw on for how they could proceed without panicking if similar situations occurred in actual projects. And with all of these responses, again, from a pedagogical perspective, I guess one of the challenges is at what point do we deliberately move away from best practices? Obviously, we'll spend a lot of time focusing on when things go right situations. So, at what point do we sprinkle in the chaos? Is it in every course? Is it, at a certain point of their studies? And I don't have any right answers for that. I think that's something else which would benefit from empirical research. I'm just presenting some ideas based on what I'm hearing from our alumni. Here's another response to the same question. Deliberately move the goalposts based on what happens in the industry. So some examples. Source content gets changed or added to. More needs to be done than previously thought. File formats present conversion issues. Clients bounce content back because they simply don't like it. Deadlines change. Machine translation or a client's TM have to be used. So there's that mandating of resources. These are things that made me panic when I first started out after graduating. In our classes, everything always went according to plan. The industry doesn't, right? So, but that's the thing, right? I think it's human nature in pedagogical settings to have things go according to plan. But it seems like there's this need to also occasionally let go of that based on the fact that things don't go according to plan in the industry. And again, this all ties in with adaptive expertise. One more response to the same question. In the translation courses, I would recommend projects with no brief or with little background. Brief as like a commission, the translation commission. No indication of the target client, partially illegible source texts. Here we see the changing deadlines again. Assignments given with no advance notice. The requirement to use a certain translation tool or to deliver content in a certain format, and huge projects that would necessitate subcontracting. These are things I encounter all the time. Yeah, I mean, and this is really helpful advice, really helpful insight in terms of how we could set things up. I think students would be frustrated by this. I think trainers would be equally frustrated by this, but I see it as a necessity, at least to some extent in preparing students for work in this somewhat chaotic language industry. And then, sorry, I thought it was the last response. Here's one more I wanted to share. A big part of adaptive expertise, I think, involves seeing the bigger picture of the industry from multiple perspectives. In the translation courses, we occasionally talked about a hypothetical client, but why not also talk about how any given translation might go in very different directions based on things like the presence of a project manager or a terminology manager or a quality assurance team. We did this in the PM, the project management course that we have in our curriculum, but why not in the translation courses as well? So this sort of meta competence, right? Seeing the bigger picture and how translation fits into a much broader project life cycle. They were calling for more of this across the curriculum. Okay, so now the actual weaving adaptive expertise into competence frameworks, and I'm basing this on the EMT competence framework. This is fresh off the press. I think this was rolled out last month, if I'm not mistaken. In my previous talks, I've based things on the 2017 version of the competence framework, but this is now coming from the 2022 version. And EMT defines competence as the proven ability to use knowledge, skills, and personal, social, or methodological abilities in work or study situations and in professional and personal development. In the TPR community, you see two different takes on this. Some feel that it's important to keep competence and expertise as distinct. In fact, I think with Isabella Cruz and Greg Shreve, I forget what year that was, we were also calling this whole notion of competence into question. That being said, I think we need to talk about competence in pedagogical settings. And I think it's actually a mistake to try to keep the two separate, expertise and competence as distinct from each other. And Greg even said that Greg Shreve actually said there is a place for talking about competence and talking about expertise in pedagogical settings. Or it's not just about psychological or cognitive realities, but actually measurable learning outcomes and skills. So, in a nutshell, this is the general approach that I would recommend for weaving adaptive expertise into competence models. You're deliberately taking students outside of their comfort zone by diversifying task attributes. So what they're undertaking, how they're undertaking these tasks, and by or with whom. The challenging part, again, is knowing when is the right time to do this. Do we do this right from the start, or do we introduce this after students have established their comfort zone? And I see pros and cons to both approaches. So let's look at some of the concrete pillars in the EMT competence framework. One of these is translation, which they break down into strategic, methodological, and thematic competence. Subcompetence 5 involves, being able to implement the instructions, style guides, or conventions relevant to a particular translation. And again, from an adaptive expertise perspective, at some stage, it's also important to introduce or change these on the fly once the project is already underway with little lead time. And again, the inherent constraints associated with pedagogy and training only allow for this to a certain extent. And that's what we need to sort of iron out. At what point do we introduce this and how? Also important here from an adaptive expertise perspective, having students discuss and gauge the impact of doing so, changing things on the fly, from the perspectives of time, quality, and cost, right? Where it's not just about quality. I think we need to focus more on time and cost, at least hypothetically speaking, how these factor into things, right? In the competence domain of technology, which involves tools and applications, subcompetence 18 says it's important that students understand the basics of MT systems and their impact on the translation process, and integrate machine translation into a translation workflow where appropriate. I would call for expanding on MT and talking about artificial intelligence in a broader sense. And again, this idea of gauging impact, not just in terms of quality, but also in terms of productivity and cost. And yeah, examining the role or the impact of machine translation through a lens of not just what's happening during actual translation, but also what's happening upstream and downstream, and its impact on various stakeholder constellations. So looking at data curation. I mean, I guess most university programs have incorporated post-editing, as a classic example of something that's happening downstream and something that's obviously very important in the industry. But the fact of the matter is, if we go back to our freelancers, pay for post-editing is lousy. It's absolutely lousy. And I don't know. I mean, perhaps some of you in attendance make a living exclusively through post-editing. But, I think it's important to look at things happening upstream, looking at natural language processing, looking at data curation, with the idea being that you could have a language industry professional working across strands and doing multiple things simultaneously. That's the point that I'm making here. Also in this technology domain, yeah, this is not one of the sub-competence, but just a take-home message. Technology competence goes beyond the direct application of tools. Really above and beyond that, this awareness and articulation of both constraints and affordances of various technologies in line with variation in project specifications is really, really important. Not just for translators, but this obviously is at the heart of LSP consulting as well. People who are working as solutions architects need to be able to articulate this. And I see this as growing in importance in the industry as well as a career path. This idea of going to companies or organizations and providing consulting services where you talk about the technologies and the constraints and the affordances, really, really important. In the domain of personal and interpersonal competence, how can we weave adaptive expertise into this area? Subcompetence 25 says, take account of and adapt to the organizational and physical ergonomics of the working environment. We can add cognitive ergonomics to this list as well. And this is where these simulated project-based workflows come into play, involving different constellations of stakeholders, different levels of collaboration, and different project management systems and communication channels. The fact of the matter is, in the industry, we probably don't find stakeholders interacting with each other through discussion boards and learning management systems. And for whatever reason, the whole soft skills side of expertise has been largely neglected, in training contexts, with the assumption being, students will pick up on this on the job. I think the fact that we have situated cognition and the whole sociological dimension to expertise, I'm hoping that will change things, because communication is such a big deal, in terms of projects running smoothly. So focusing more on the so-called soft skills, and perhaps soft skills has a stigma attached to it as something that's negative, but really at the end of the day, translation is about communication. And the question there becomes, why don't we focus more in training contexts on the actual art of communication among stakeholders? And from an adaptive expertise, having these different constellations, so that students can experience what will happen in the industry upon graduation. And then, yeah, from a cognitive and organizational ergonomic standpoint, have learners identify and respond to strengths and weaknesses to optimize this idea of shared cognition or team expertise for purposes of task allocation. Very, very little research has been done on this in the language industry. But if we have this collaboration, for example, in the context of a translation management system, we need to see how tasks are allocated. How are strengths and weaknesses identified and utilized in coming up with a successful outcome, right? So shared and team expertise. And I think this fits into both the information processing paradigm and also the cognitive translatology paradigm when we're talking about shared or team expertise. So the same subcompetence 25, I think another really important competence that perhaps isn't directly articulated in the EMT framework, training contingency planning to account for everything that could possibly go wrong. So and this is something that happens all the time, overestimation of abilities when taking on a project, or underestimation of time needed to do so, to complete projects. Stakeholders falling ill, or the necessity of ad hoc subcontracting, or these tech constraints and mandates we've been talking about, as well as the very common shifting goalposts. So contingency planning, this is at the heart of project management training. I think it's equally important to weave this into other courses in a curriculum as well, so you can account for, what do you do when things go wrong types of scenarios, which are quite common with so many moving parts. And finally, the service provision domain of the EMT framework, subcompetence 27, monitor and take account of new societal and language industry demands, new market requirements, and emerging job profiles. Yeah, things are changing rapidly. And I think, this doesn't necessarily tie in with adaptive expertise beyond the scope of being aware of changes in career paths. I think we need to get students into workplaces more often over the course of their studies. In a past life, I studied elementary education. And I remember in my first semester, one of my courses was a field experience course where I went into the schools and simply observed and took notes, like from an ethnographic perspective. And I think this would be extremely helpful in training contexts in the language industry as well. Why not get our students out into the workplace right from the start and have multiple check-in points over the course of their studies so they truly grasp the complexity of the industry and what's going on. Internships come to mind there as well. Hopefully at some point we'll see more in the way of remote internships where students are embedded in translation management systems, to the extent, of course, that things like non-disclosure agreements would enable that. That often stands in the way of remote internships. More in the way of shadowing and mentoring opportunities. That's where I think alumni can also be instrumental. They're very eager to give back. So actually formalizing this shadowing and mentoring would be helpful. And then having exit projects or theses that involve workplace studies, where you actually have students working on the ground, not working, but doing research on the ground in LSPs to document things like what's going well and where there might be room for improvement. All of this somehow connects with adaptive expertise. So just one final parting thought. I was going to have more than one, which is why it still says thoughts, but I'll just leave it at one here, especially since we got off to a slight delay here. Adapting, whether in the world of work or in our training, means letting go of the tried and true. And that's much, much easier said than done. I think there's a natural inclination to want to stay in our comfort zones. But I see this as an absolute necessity given the nature of the language industry. I see it as our ethical obligation to the future language industry professionals that we're training, that we get things right and that we focus on things like adaptive expertise, focus on things like alumni survey data to see what's going on and then embrace that in our training. Thank you. That's all I have.
Yep, thank you, Erik. Are there any questions? See in the chat. Yes. Can you hear this from? Yeah, speak.
I just have a comment. I think a lot of what we help make this transition into thinking potential problems about potential problems.
Can you hear this, Erik?
About 50% of it. I'm sorry, I couldn't. If you could repeat that.
Here?
Summarize.
If you could say it one more time. I'm sorry.
Yeah, she's coming.
Oh, okay, got you.
Okay, hello, Professor. I have a comment and a suggestion, probably. I think it's a way to address these potential problems in translation
could be, which could be difficult, like you mentioned, is to redesign the way the courses are taught.
Mm-hmm.
And I just read a brand new book that is called Indirect Translation Explained. And it caught my eye that it actually has examples that guide you through potential problems in translation. Exactly like that. It has a website where you can download resources, and it has an activity on what could be wrong, what do you have to think ahead, and how you're going to solve it from different perspectives. So I think those materials are coming now, are starting to be published and to be used in class. But what I also what I found interesting about this book is that the book is called Indirect Translation. It's not called Theories in Translation. It's not called, but that it's a combination of many areas, but apply into what goes in the industry. So I think those changes are now occurring. Thank you.
That's good. I mean, I think that's what we need more of. And that was one of my motivations in directly asking our alumni, what ill-defined tasks do you encounter? Because it's really, really hard for us to simulate that based on our intuition. And it's not just a matter of undoing well-defined tasks. It's not just a matter of saying, I think one of the alumni said, don't give them a brief. And that's kind of a very basic example of undoing well-definedness. It's more than that, though, and I think we need concrete empirical data where we hear from alumni or hear from stakeholders where they talk about this messiness. And then we use that as a springboard or a point of departure for giving shape to, what's actually doable in pedagogical contexts. So thank you for the advice on that book. I haven't seen that. I'll have to take a look and see what type of exercises they have. That sounds very promising.
Yeah. Listen, can you also maybe come here? Sorry. Huh?
Didn't hit.
Hit?
The camera is still off.
Okay. Okay, so listen.
Still.
Never mind.
Yes.
Dr. Angelone, thank you so much for the presentation. It's very interesting. I just have a comment. I think like if we look at landscape language industry, it could be very, very confusing to students. And I think like translation programs should be confusing too to students in the terms of, no, seriously, in the terms of when they go through the program and study certain things, they actually don't know why they studied that. And they don't see like the big picture yet, why they studied that. I think if a student graduates from the master's program, and knowing what they studied and what they want to do, I think that's a bad sign, because it's like the industry is like it's a moving target. You don't know what's out there.
Yeah.
So the idea is with the statistics, the numbers that you provided, like 3% of the graduates worked as translators. So this brings up the question that to what extent the translation practice courses prepare students to be like good translators in the industry, or like, I mean, do they really help them in the industry out there? Like, I don't want to go to the, like, I don't want to have a drastic opinion about this, but this is like, I think there must be room in our programs for those adaptive skills that you're talking about.
Right.
Students shouldn't know why they're learning Python, for example, the basics of Python and the program, or why they're studying like a version control systems like Git or GitHub. And when they go out there and they just start exploring what's in the industry, they start making, they start linking what they studied to what's out there.
Yeah.
But just to me, the idea that someone graduates from the program knowing why they studied everything and what they want to do, this is a bad sign. And this is actually just one last comment.
Yeah.
is actually for the cross-language mediation course that on the undergrad level. It was interesting when students started that course, they all of them wanted to be like literary translators, freelance translators, some type of a translator. When they finished that, like their responses, I mean, the post-test like showed like completely different responses because they don't know what's out there or what they should learn, you know, before they graduate. So yeah, that's my comment. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Husan. Those are really important points. And, you know, of course, there are constraints on just how much of this we can pack into a curriculum. That's one of the reasons why I was saying it's really important to get students into workplaces in varying capacities right from the start. So something like a field experience component where they go and simply observe and simply interact with stakeholders and get a better feel for what concrete skills they're using on the job, that can be very helpful. You know, and it seems like our program and perhaps many programs worldwide are kind of sticking to specialized translation. I mean, the fact of the matter is these graduates are still finding work in these other domains, but how steep is the learning curve? You know, if they've just mainly been hearing about translation over the course of their studies. But again, this is one of the benefits of alumni survey research, to see what they're doing and to hear back from them. You know, ideally, they're in a good position to talk about the industry. They're also in an ideal position to talk about the curriculum and its strengths and its weaknesses and what might benefit from change. So, you know, it's been very, very eye-opening for me in that regard to see which courses they thought were helpful, which courses they thought weren't particularly helpful. And, you know, the ball is sort of in our court now to potentially restructure things. And going back to what you said, Hussam, about not knowing what they're going to do until they graduate, you're right. I know that one of our colleagues, Professor Bilali, is working on a career paths in the language industry course right now. So students have a rough idea of the landscape, so they know what's out there. So that would work nicely in parallel with, you know, a field experience component where they actually hear about career paths in a classroom setting, but also can directly observe this in the world of work. So, yeah.
Yep. One more question from here.
Hi, Erik.
Hi.
Teresa Vilignosho. Great to meet you virtually, and thank you for
Likewise.
this. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this great talk, and thank you also for surveying the alums. I wanted to ask if you could follow up a little bit about your thoughts about pros and cons of introducing the realistic messiness of the industry to our students right away versus later on. And just to kind of give one perspective. So I'm teaching the grad research and writing course to 11 of the 12 first semester students. And we are using a writing workbook, and it's got very explicit instructions. And, you know, but I also, because it's a project-based learning course, so they're all doing different projects, I also leave it very open. And some students are responding very well to that. And some, you know, have had resistance, let's call it, you know, to that. And you know, and I want to tell them that, you know, this is a lot more structured than what you're actually going to encounter in your actual career. So can you just talk about your pros and cons that you're seeing for beginning earlier with messiness versus later?
Yeah, I mean, those are really, really important points. And I think that's one of the pedagogical, I wouldn't say it's a constraint, but this whole notion of deliberate scaffolding and structuring, students tend to want that, you know, and, you know, to some extent, I think it's absolutely necessary as well to sort of set the stage. And I don't really have any best practice suggestions in terms of how to set things up, when to introduce the chaos and to make things messy. I mean, perhaps it's a matter of discussing the messiness as opposed to actually having applied activities in place that are deliberately messy, and then you gradually transition into this greater sense of open-endedness. But I think the research and writing course that we have in our curriculum in particular lends itself well to open-endedness. You know, and learning by doing and project-based collaboration. So it's tricky. And I think all instructors, all faculty need to be on board with these discussions so that things are synced. You know, if a collective decision is made to sprinkle this in across the curriculum, then everybody would kind of have to let go of what they're doing in their courses and figure out how this would work. Or it might make sense to just identify a couple of courses and really go all in with this chaos in those courses. I'd like to hear from others in that regard. I'm not sure, again, that's why I was saying if there's any empirical research on this, not even necessarily in translation studies, but in other fields to see what works. Or also hearing from our alumni in that sense. I know with the research and writing course in particular, as they're taking the course, sometimes students are frustrated, but then you hear back from alumni after they graduate and they say, that course was really important. That's where I learned this, what you were saying with the open-endedness. That's where I learned these crucial skills that are important in the industry. So they don't get it until after the fact, which is interesting. And I'm sure that applies to other courses as well. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Teresa. Yeah.
There's a question in the chat.
No, it's from another platform.
Okay.
It's like Celeste has her hand up, right? Is that the one I'm seeing?
Okay, yes, this. Okay, go
Hi.
ahead.
Hi, yeah, you can see me. I'm sorry, my camera is turned off, but can you guys hear me well?
Yes.
Oh, hi, everybody. So basically, I'm very glad for the question that, or the comment from Dr. Vijay Ignacio now, because that's exactly what I was thinking. I'm teaching the legal and commercial translation class online, and just based on my experience, and even as a student, as a grad of the master's student, I'm thinking of all these comments and realizing that maybe they are the responses you got in the survey, maybe alumni are able to reflect that way precisely because of the years that have passed and the experience that they have gained post graduation. And I'm thinking, I have students, and I think the key would be what Dr. Vijay Ignacio was saying about the differences in students. I still have students that deliver 30 seconds, 1 minute, 2 minutes, or 5 minutes before the deadline. So I'm here thinking, how are we going to play with deadlines and make that a messy situation when they still don't have the concept of deadlines and the importance of meeting deadlines? And also, especially, I guess, with the online programs that are available now, the adult population, adult students, people that have children like myself, and like many of you guys here, I know, people that have full-time jobs, and how that would, and maybe they are able to acquire these soft skills that we're so much talking about elsewhere. So I would be interested to know if you know anything about the demographics of the students that answer those questions. Maybe they are younger, maybe in their 20s, 30s, post-graduation, or are they more like adult learners, and how those differences would play out.
That's a really important point, Celeste. I think I asked demographic questions. I don't know about the level of granularity, but they all graduated in the past 5 years, at least on the data I was reporting on today. But yeah, it would be important to look at some of those variables. And I wonder if people who are, quote unquote, non-traditional students, if they have a better capacity to adapt because they're juggling so many things simultaneously, being a parent and working full time and studying, or if it's the opposite, if they actually, have a greater need for structure. But that's another angle. I haven't even looked at that angle yet in explaining some of the findings. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you.
Okay, so there seems to be no more questions in the room and in the chat room, in the physical and virtual room. So thanks a lot, Erik. It was a very insightful presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Mikhail, and thanks everyone.